The 2026 World Cup was already going to be unlike anything football had ever seen before. 48 teams, 16 host cities, 3 countries, 1 tournament. The numbers alone are staggering. And from the moment FIFA announced this format, the world of football understood that pulling it off would require a level of coordination and logistical precision that no World Cup in history had ever demanded. But somewhere along the way, something started to shift. As 2026 drew closer, a specific kind of conversation began emerging in football circles. Not the excitement about the games, not the debate about which teams were favorites. Something more practical, something more uncomfortable. Questions about travel, questions about timing, questions about what it actually means to stage a tournament across 3 massive, geographically distinct countries, and whether the ambition of the format had outpaced the reality of executing it. And right at the center of those conversations, 2 names kept coming up: Canada and Mexico. Not as problems, as solutions, as the 2 hosting partners whose role in this tournament quietly expanded from supporting cast to something considerably more essential than anyone initially anticipated. So, what exactly happened? And why are football fans, analysts, and FIFA insiders now talking about Canada and Mexico in a way that sounds less like partners and more like saviors? That's what we're getting into today. To understand what Canada and Mexico have done for this tournament, you need to understand what the original vision of FIFA 2026 looked like and where that vision started running into friction. When the joint bid from the United States, Canada, and Mexico won the hosting rights back in 2018, the basic framework was clear. The U.S. would be the dominant host. 11 of the 16 host cities were American. The marquee venues, the knockout stages, the final itself, all of it was anchored in the U.S. Canada and Mexico were allocated a smaller portion of the group stage games, presented somewhat as regional additions to an essentially American tournament. It made sense on paper. The U.S. has the infrastructure, the stadiums, the hotel capacity, the transport networks. It knows what the logistical demands look like. But as preparations moved from planning into execution, a series of complications began to surface on the American side of the operation. Visa processing concerns for fans from certain countries became a genuine talking point. Travel costs between American host cities, many of them separated by enormous distances, started generating concern among supporters trying to plan multi-game trips. And the sheer scale of the American leg of the tournament, spread across cities from Seattle to Miami, from New York to Los Angeles, created coordination challenges that grew more visible with every passing month of preparation. None of this amounted to a crisis. Nothing collapsed. FIFA was not facing some emergency that required a dramatic intervention. But there was a growing recognition among the people paying closest attention that the tournament needed certain things to go right in ways that were not entirely guaranteed. And it was precisely in that context that what Canada and Mexico were quietly delivering started to look considerably more significant. Here's where things get interesting. While the American side of the operation was navigating its complications, the Canadian and Mexican preparations were generating a different kind of conversation entirely. Toronto and Vancouver, the 2 Canadian host cities, had been running their preparations with a consistency and a community engagement that earned genuinely positive reviews from the football world. Canadian football culture had transformed dramatically in the years since the hosting rights were awarded. The Canadian national team's qualification for Qatar 2022, their first World Cup in 36 years, had ignited a domestic passion for the game that made the prospect of hosting matches in 2026 feel genuinely electric rather than merely ceremonial. The organizational groundwork in both Canadian cities was progressing with a smoothness that the people monitoring these things noticed. Volunteer programs, fan engagement, transportation planning, all of it moving at a pace and with a quality that generated quiet confidence in the Canadian contribution to the overall tournament. Mexico City and Guadalajara told a similar story, but with an added dimension that made them particularly important to the overall shape of the tournament. Mexico has hosted the World Cup twice before, in 1970 and 1986. It is one of the most experienced World Cup host nations on the planet, and that experience shows. The organizational knowledge, the infrastructure, the crowd culture, the deep, passionate, multi-generational love for football that runs through Mexican society, all of it was visible in how Mexico host cities approach their preparations. El Estadio Azteca in Mexico City is one of the most iconic football venues in the world. The plan to have the 2026 World Cup open at the Azteca, in the same stadium where Diego Maradona scored the hand of God and the goal of the century, gave the tournament an opening that was loaded with history and meaning in a way that no American stadium, however large and modern, could quite replicate. This matters because one of the underlying anxieties about FIFA 2026 had always been about soul, about whether a tournament spread across 3 countries, anchored primarily in American cities that were simultaneously hosting American football seasons and running American political calendars, would feel like a football event or feel like a corporate exercise. Mexico's contribution answered that question before it could fully form. But there's another angle here that goes beyond stadium atmosphere and organizational competence. Think about the fan experience for a moment, because one of the more underappreciated aspects of what Canada and Mexico bring to this tournament is what they represent for the millions of football supporters who will travel to North America in the summer of 2026. The 2026 World Cup will draw fans from every continent, from Europe, from South America, from Africa, from Asia, from every corner of the world where football is the sport that defines culture and community and national identity. And many of those fans, particularly those from Latin America, from Central America, from the Caribbean, will find themselves with a connection to the North American leg of the tournament that goes considerably deeper than tourism. For Mexican fans, this is a home World Cup in the most literal sense. For fans from across Latin America, crossing into Mexico to watch their national team play in front of a crowd that understands the culture, speaks the language, shares the passion, that is a completely different experience than navigating the logistics of an American city that is hosting a World Cup the way it might host a Super Bowl. And for Canadian fans, a country that qualified for 2022 and will be playing competitive football on home soil for the first time in this format, the emotional significance of Toronto or Vancouver hosting group stage matches involving the Canadian national team is genuinely difficult to overstate. The bigger issue is this. FIFA 2026 was always going to live or die by its atmosphere, by whether the tournament felt alive in the way that great World Cups feel alive, where the football is inseparable from the human energy surrounding it, where the host nation's passion becomes part of the experience rather than merely a backdrop to it. In this regard, Mexico and Canada are not simply delivering their allocated matches competently. They are providing something the overall tournament needs: heart, identity, the kind of authentic football culture that turns a logistical exercise into an event that people will still be talking about 20 years from now. Look at the historical context for a moment. When the United States hosted the 1994 World Cup, there were significant doubts about whether America was ready, whether football culture was deep enough, whether the tournament would feel authentic in a country where the sport was still developing. What happened instead was one of the most successful World Cups in the tournament's history. Record attendances, iconic moments, a tournament that surprised everyone who had doubted it and accelerated the growth of football in the United States in ways that are still being felt today. That 1994 tournament worked in part because of the Mexican fans who crossed the border in enormous numbers, who brought their passion and their color and their noise into American stadiums and helped create an atmosphere that felt genuinely South American despite the North American setting. History, it appears, is repeating itself. Except this time, Mexico is not simply sending fans across a border. It is hosting matches of its own. It is an official partner in the largest World Cup ever staged. And the contribution it is making, culturally, atmospherically, organizationally, is visible to anyone paying attention. Canada's evolution is perhaps the more surprising part of the story, because it has happened so rapidly. A decade ago, Canadian football was a sport searching for relevance on a national stage, dominated by hockey and basketball and American football. Today, it is something genuinely different. A national team that qualified for Qatar, a professional league that is growing, a fan base that has discovered the game in a way that feels organic and real rather than manufactured. Hosting a World Cup tends to accelerate exactly this kind of cultural shift. The infrastructure investment, the global attention, the experience of watching the world's best players compete in your cities, all of it leaves a residue that raises the baseline permanently. For Canadian football, 2026 is not just a hosting assignment, it is a coming of age. Now, let's talk about what comes next, because while the preparations for Canada and Mexico are generating positive momentum, there are still significant questions about how the overall tournament will flow and how FIFA manages the inherent complexity of a 48-team competition across 3 countries. The travel demands on players are considerable. A team that plays a group stage match in Mexico City and then must travel to a venue in the northeastern United States for a round of 16 fixture is covering serious ground. The time zone differences, the travel fatigue, the adaptation required, these are genuine competitive factors that football governing bodies and team managers will have to navigate carefully. Fan travel between host countries requires crossing international borders, which adds layers of complexity that a single-nation tournament simply does not have. The visa situation for supporters from certain nations has generated ongoing discussion, and the solutions FIFA and the host nations implement will significantly affect how accessible the tournament feels for a genuinely global fan base. The best-case scenario is one that looks increasingly possible given what we have seen from the preparations. A tournament where the 3-country format becomes a feature rather than a complication, where the contrast between Mexican football culture, Canadian football enthusiasm, and American logistical scale creates a genuinely diverse experience that reflects the global nature of the sport itself. Where the organizational work that Canada and Mexico have been quietly delivering ensures that their portions of the tournament run smoothly enough to serve as the backbone of the entire event. The more challenging scenario involves the logistical complexity becoming visible in ways that affect the experience. Fans struggling with border crossings, scheduling creating travel headaches, the sheer size of the tournament producing moments where the ambition and the execution fall slightly out of alignment. FIFA will be monitoring all of this closely, and the decisions made in the remaining preparation period about scheduling, about fan support infrastructure, and about how the tournament is communicated to the global audience will determine which of these scenarios comes closer to reality. What is already clear is that Canada and Mexico have done something that was not guaranteed when this hosting arrangement was first confirmed. They have exceeded expectations. They have delivered preparations that have given FIFA and the football world genuine reasons for confidence at a moment when confidence was needed. They have, in a very real sense, demonstrated that the 3-country format is not just workable, but potentially inspired. That the diversity of the hosting arrangement, the cultural range, the football heritage, the different relationships that different parts of the world have with North American football could produce a tournament that is richer and more representative of global football than a single-nation event could ever be. The 2026 World Cup is coming, and if the preparations tell us anything, it's that when the tournament begins with that opening match at the Estadio Azteca, in one of the most iconic football stadiums in the world, in front of a crowd that lives and breathes this game, the questions about whether North America was ready will feel very distant indeed. That opening match will not be in an American city. It will be in Mexico City, in the Azteca, and that detail alone says something significant about what Mexico and Canada have contributed to this tournament. So, here's a question for you. Do you think the 3-country format is a strength or a risk for FIFA 2026? And which of the 3 host nations do you think will produce the most memorable moments when the football finally begins? Drop your thoughts in the comments. This is exactly the kind of conversation worth having before the greatest show in football gets underway. If you found this useful and want to stay across everything happening in the build-up to 2026, subscribe and hit the bell. We cover it all. The football, the politics, the logistics, and the stories that don't always make the front page. This story is still developing. And as always, football never stays quiet for long. See you in the next one.